So, first of all, what is a critical argument? Well, first of all, critical thinking, or thinking in a critical way, is a very important part of learning. It involves gathering evidence, weighing it up in an open way, in an honest way, and using that evidence to create a critical argument to give reasons for the conclusions drawn. The benefits of critical arguments are that they create greater self-awareness, and they create awareness of others. And you could say that critical arguments are essential for any manager to be able to assess evidence in a logical way. And it often becomes necessary as a manager to defend or explain a decision. And often by producing evidence, it will demonstrate fairness of thinking as well. Now, it's also very clear that the coaching process itself can enable people to develop critical thinking. So critical thinking and coaching are quite closely intertwined with each other. In session 1, we learned that many writers will offer different opinions about the history of coaching. We heard that some link it to Stone Age and some link it to Greek history and so on. But some of these arguments are only based on opinion. So if we look at one of the claims that's made, and that's what we'll look at today in this session, that some of the authors link coaching to ancient Greece, and in particular to the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. Now I wonder what the evidence is for this statement, and also what are the reasons why some people make this claim that coaching comes from ancient Greek. So keep those questions in mind as we progress. It is true that Socratic questioning is indeed about the pursuit of self-knowledge and truth. It is a particular technique which involves asking questions, answering questions. It's an attempt to stimulate critical thinking and to illuminate ideas. So in that sense, it could be linked quite strongly to the idea of coaching. However, it's also important to realize that Socratic dialogue was seen as a group process, not a one-to-one process as coaching is. So therefore groups would establish a kind of debate. It's about generating and deliberately creating opposing or conflicting arguments with the purpose of defending one particular view and putting down another. So in that sense, it's a competitive process. And some argue that because it's competitive, and because it's about looking at the very small points all the time, that it can lead to a kind of cynical approach to thinking. And you could say that's not really anything to do with how we understand coaching. So, some comments on this. The evidence that coaching is linked to Socratic dialogue is debatable, and it's not really fully in line with current thinking. Some of the thoughts about Socratic dialogue do fit, but they don't all. So overall, it's not a compelling argument that coaching comes from ancient Greeks, and in particular from Socrates. But what might be the reason, as I asked earlier, to make these claims? Well, you could say that by saying that coaching is linked to ancient Greece, that coaching has a long history, a long pedigree, and therefore it has a lot of credibility. And I think that might be one of the main reasons why people may engage in such discussions or such arguments.
And now, some critical arguments about some of the claims made about mentoring.
So, mentoring is very strongly linked to Homer's Odyssey. In this story, the word mentor is used, and mentor is in fact a character in the story. And many modern writers, because that word is used in the ancient Greek story, say that mentoring comes from ancient Greece. And to remind you, these are some of the themes that people generate from that ancient Greek story to help explain how mentoring has developed to its current state of thinking. In many ways, they're making a direct link to the history of mentoring and in particular to Homer. But what are the critical arguments that are associated with these thoughts? Is this really the case? What else needs to be taken into account when we think about this ancient historical linking to Homer's Odyssey? Well, we have to take into account the historical context, first of all. It's important to remember that ancient Greece was a very, very long time ago. And one of the things that was very common in ancient Greek society was that men were very, very dominating. It was also quite a violent society. Those that were wealthy were fine, those that weren't. And Homer's Odyssey is a story with much violence in it, much merciless violence in it. There are examples of strong hierarchies, paternalism, macho violence and control. And in fact, the story of Mentor himself in the story of Homer's Odyssey is that Mentor was a failure. He couldn't do the job. What actually happened was that the head of all the gods, Zeus, sent his daughter Athena to take Mentor's place because Telemachus was seen as a very important prince and potentially king of Ithaca. And this idea that mentoring, that many modern writers say is about fostering independence, doesn't seem to be true. It's a false interpretation because Telemachus had no choice. He was born as a prince and he was helped every single step of the way by Athena, who was in the form of Mentor. Let's look at the medieval arguments from history. We looked at the knight and squire. It was about heroic ideas of rescuing people, damsels in distress, role modeling, developing manhood, fighting against social ills. And if we look at the apprenticeship model, which also some people link to modern day mentoring, it was about developing skills, proficiency at certain things. And it was an important relationship model, many people argue. But if we consider the historical context yet again, we have to remember that the knight and squire relationship was a feudalist one. It was an era which was full of injustice, disease, and poverty. And a knight was basically a mercenary, a soldier who was paid to kill people. The period of time was violent, it was macho, and it was aggressive. It was a savage time. But many people in modern writings which link mentoring to this romanticize this and put forward this notice of this notion of heroicism and chivalry. The apprenticeship relationship, by looking at medieval writings, was in fact abusive, exploitative. It was legally binding, but there was a 50% dropout rate. Again, this is perhaps an example of uncritical romanticism, linking mentoring to these ancient times. So, some comments. The evidence is debatable and not really in line with current writings on mentoring at all. Overall, these arguments which link mentoring to ancient Greece or to medieval periods are not particularly compelling. They're nice, but they're not compelling. They are romanticized versions. So could these historical claims be giving credibility to mentoring? Yes, that's probably the case. What is clear is that the model put forward by Fenelon in the 18th century is perhaps a model which we can now subscribe to as an approach to mentoring, which seems to work.